For months she told me, "I can't," shutting down every conversation as if her words were the end of all negotiations. Then one day she turned around and said, "You must pay. Not with money, but with everything that mattered to me. My peace, my time, my very sanity." And in the end, I realized there was no middle ground, no compromise. Either I could leave, or she must go. That's when I understood what it meant to be cornered by someone who once swore they cared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Damian, and until all this happened, I thought I understood what love, loyalty, and partnership were supposed to look like. I worked in construction management in a small but bustling town called Riverview, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. My life until then was structured, predictable, and steady. I wasn't rich, but I earned enough to live comfortably, to enjoy weekends by the river, to treat my mother to Sunday dinners, and to build a life I thought would eventually expand into marriage and children with the right person. I valued reliability and honesty. I believed that a person's word was their bond. That belief, as I would later learn, was my greatest weakness. When I met Clara, she seemed to embody everything I admired. She was outspoken, lively, and carried herself with a charm that drew people to her instantly. Where I was cautious and deliberate, she was spontaneous and daring. She told stories that could make a whole room laugh, and when she looked at you, it was as though you were the only one who existed in her world. We met at a community fundraiser organized at the local fire hall, one of those small-town events filled with raffles, homemade pies, and cheap coffee in styrofoam cups. I wasn't planning to stay long, but she struck up a conversation with me over a spilled cup of punch, and from that moment, I felt as though life had shifted. In those early weeks, I believed she was the answer to the quiet yearning I had carried for companionship. Clara was attentive in a way that made me feel chosen. She texted me good morning before I even left for work, and she called me at night just to ask about the small details of my day. She seemed interested in everything I said, even the mundane frustrations about delayed shipments and budget meetings. She told me more than once that she had been waiting for someone like me, someone grounded, reliable, and not caught up in playing games. Her words at that stage felt like a balm to the doubts I sometimes carried about being enough. Looking back, I realized there were moments I should have paid closer attention to, subtle hints that all was not as perfect as it seemed. She had a way of shutting down when the conversation turned toward anything serious about the future. If I asked about her long-term goals or where she saw herself in a year, she would laugh and say, "I can't think about that right now," brushing it off as if planning was a burden too heavy to carry. At the time, I chalked it up to her free spirit. I told myself it was good to balance my rigid planning with her sense of living in the moment. But that phrase, "I can't," became a recurring motif in our relationship, one that grew heavier the more I tried to push past it. Clara's life was a patchwork of jobs and hobbies. One week she was a barista, the next she was taking a short course in photography, and soon after, she was selling handmade jewelry online. I admired her creativity, but it bothered me that she had no sense of stability. Every time I asked if she wanted help creating a plan or building something sustainable, she would stiffen, her eyes narrowing as if I had insulted her independence. "I can't live like that," she'd say sharply, and the conversation would die right there. It became clear that her "I can't" wasn't just about the future. It was about any form of responsibility, commitment, or accountability. Despite this, the good times in those first few months blinded me to the weight of her words. We spent weekends hiking the trails outside of town, evenings watching old movies, and long mornings sharing coffee in her small apartment, sunlight spilling across her mismatched furniture. Clara could make me laugh until my ribs hurt, and she had a knack for making even a grocery store run feel like an adventure. I told myself that her resistance to planning wasn't such a big deal, that maybe I was just overthinking. After all, wasn't it good to have someone who could pull me out of my routines and remind me to live? But then the refusals started stacking up. Whenever I asked if she wanted to meet my family, she said, "I can't." If I suggested going on a short trip together, she'd shake her head, "I can't right now." Even small things, like committing to dinner on Friday or helping me with a house project, were met with the same two words, It was as if those words were her shield, keeping her free from any tie, any promise. And though it stung, I still didn't see the storm forming on the horizon. What I didn't realize then was that "I can't" was not simply about timing or circumstance. It was her way of controlling the terms of our relationship, of holding me close enough to feel wanted but far enough to avoid accountability. I thought patience and understanding would eventually win her over, that she would see I wasn't asking for too much. But as I would soon learn, Clara's "I can't" was only the beginning. Because the day would come when she shifted from refusal to demand, from "I can't" to "you must pay." And that was the day everything began to unravel. Clara's presence in my life grew quickly, almost too quickly, until she was woven into the fabric of my daily routines. If she wasn't sitting in the passenger seat of my truck with her bare feet on the dashboard, she was at my apartment, leaving behind little pieces of herself, her favorite mug on my counter, a stack of her photography prints leaning against my wall, a sweater draped casually across the back of my chair. She never officially moved in, but her presence filled every corner of my space. At first, it felt comforting, like I was no longer living in an empty shell. My evenings, which used to be quiet and predictable, were now filled with her laughter, her music, and her restless energy. She made my home feel alive in a way it never had before. Despite her constant presence, Clara remained elusive when it came to discussions about defining our relationship. I was used to clarity, to calling things what they were, but whenever I tried to bring up where we stood, she would either dodge the question or shut it down entirely. "I can't talk about labels," she'd say, flipping her hair over her shoulder as if that ended the matter. Labels ruin things. I found myself torn between my desire for stability and the intoxicating unpredictability she brought into my life. It was a push and pull that kept me off balance, but for a time, I convinced myself that maybe this was what love was supposed to feel like. Messy, unpredictable, yet undeniably magnetic. The people around me noticed the change in me. My mother, who had always been attuned to the smallest shifts in my mood, asked me one evening if I was happy. I hesitated before answering, because the truth was complicated. "She makes me feel alive," I told her, and my mother nodded, though her eyes carried a weight of unspoken concern. My closest friend, Marcus, was less diplomatic. "Man, I don't get it," he said after meeting Clara for the first time at a local diner. "She's fun, sure, but there's something about her, like she's not really here with you, you know? Like she's only half invested." I brushed off his comment, defensive and unwilling to see the cracks that others could already spot. During those early months, I allowed myself to be carried by the current of her world. Clara had a knack for creating excitement out of nothing. On a random Tuesday night, she'd pull me out of the apartment with no explanation, driving us out to the old drive-in theater that had been closed for years, where we'd sit on the hood of my truck and make up stories about the people who once filled the place. Another night, she dragged me to a poetry reading in a part of town I never frequented, where she clapped the loudest and laughed at lines no one else seemed to understand. I told myself this was adventure, that I needed to stop clinging to the familiar and allow myself to experience life through her lens. And for a while, I believed it was enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But there was always that phrase, her constant refrain, "I can't." It popped up in the most unexpected places. I remember one afternoon when we were sitting on the porch swing outside my apartment, sipping lemonade. I casually mentioned that my cousin was getting married in the fall and asked if she'd like to come with me. She grew quiet, her expression darkening. "I can't," she said flatly, as though the idea of standing beside me in front of my family was unbearable. When I pressed her for a reason, she grew defensive, insisting that she didn't owe me explanations for her choices. I let it go, but the sting lingered. It felt less like she couldn't, and more like she wouldn't. The more time we spent together, the clearer it became that Clara thrived on being in control of the rhythm of our relationship. If she wanted to see me, she'd show up unannounced with takeout in her hands and a grin that made it impossible to turn her away. But if I reached out first, asking to see her on a night she hadn't already planned, she'd brush me off. "I can't tonight," she'd say, often without even offering an excuse. It created an imbalance that I didn't want to admit existed. I was the one adjusting my schedule, bending my priorities, making space for her on her terms. Meanwhile, she remained unbending, holding her freedom like a weapon she could wield whenever I asked for more than she was willing to give. Yet, in those moments when she chose to let me in, it was intoxicating. Clara had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. She'd turn a late-night grocery run into a comedic adventure, sneaking items into the cart when I wasn't looking, only to burst into laughter at the checkout. She'd lie on the floor of my living room, pointing out shapes in the shadows cast on the ceiling, as though she could find magic in places most people overlooked. Being with her was like standing in the middle of a storm, chaotic, unpredictable, but alive. And I, despite knowing storms can't last forever, didn't want to step away from it. There were times I convinced myself that her reluctance to commit was just fear. She had hinted once or twice at a difficult past, mentioning a relationship that had left her wary of promises. She never gave details, but the way her eyes clouded over when she mentioned it was enough for me to fill in the blanks. I told myself she needed time, that patience and consistency would show her I was different, that I wasn't going to abandon her the way someone else might have. I clung to that narrative because it gave me hope, because it allowed me to believe that her "I can't" wasn't permanent, just temporary. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern didn't change. Every time I tried to take a step forward, she pushed back with the same resistance. I told myself the good outweighed the bad, that the laughter and closeness mattered more than the uncertainty. Still, deep down, I felt the unease building, like a pressure beneath the surface. Clara's words, her refusal, were not just about timing or circumstance. They were about control. And though I didn't fully see it yet, the day would come when her refusal turned into something much darker. When "I can't" shifted into "you must pay." That would be the moment everything I thought I understood about her unraveled completely. The beginning of everything between Clara and me had felt like a story worth telling, something bright and exhilarating, the kind of connection you stumble into when you least expect it. Looking back now, I realized that was part of why I ignored the warning signs, because those early moments had been so intoxicating. I remember the first time she came over to my apartment, standing in the doorway with a mischievous grin, holding a paper bag of pastries from a local bakery as though she were presenting me with treasure. She placed them on my counter, kicked off her shoes, and immediately made herself at home. It should have startled me how quickly she inserted herself into my space, but instead, I found it comforting. I thought it meant she felt comfortable with me, that she was letting me in. I didn't see it for what it really was, her way of taking ownership without ever acknowledging commitment. In those first weeks, Clara had a magnetic energy that I couldn't resist. She told stories about her travels, short-lived as they were, like the month she spent living out of a van in the mountains, or the few weeks she claimed she'd worked at a vineyard in France. Whether all of it was true or embellished, I couldn't say, but her delivery made me believe in her experiences, made me want to follow her into whatever adventure she dreamed up next. She had a way of making me feel as though she'd chosen me to be her confidant, her partner in crime, and I clung to that sense of being singled out. One evening, after we had been seeing each other for only a short while, she dragged me out to the edge of Riverview, where the river widened and the trees grew thick. She insisted we set up a picnic under the stars, even though the ground was damp from rain earlier that day. We lay there on the blanket, our hands brushing, and she whispered that she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "You get me, Damian," she said, her voice low and earnest, "in a way no one else ever has." It was the kind of line that lodged itself in your heart, that convinced you were special. I remember staring at her profile in the starlight, believing every word, believing she was opening herself to me in a way she didn't with anyone else. Those moments were what kept me tethered when doubt began to creep in. Clara had a talent for giving just enough to keep me hooked, then pulling back when I needed more. It was a push-and-pull dynamic that left me constantly chasing the highs, ignoring the lows, because I wanted to believe the highs meant something lasting. She was unpredictable, yes, but in those unpredictable bursts of affection and intimacy, I found myself addicted to the possibility of what we could be. I should have recognized the imbalance sooner. She never asked about my work in any real detail, even though I tried to share pieces of my day. If I mentioned a problem at the construction site or a stressful meeting, she would nod distractedly, quickly turning the conversation back to herself. She loved to talk about her ambitions, her dreams of starting her own business, though the specifics changed every week. One day it was a photography studio, the next it was a boutique, Then a vague idea about a podcast. I applauded her creativity, but deep down, I worried that she lacked the follow-through to make any of it real. Still, I told myself it wasn't my place to judge. I wanted to be supportive, to be the steady hand she could count on, even if it meant silencing my own concerns. My friends, however, weren't so easily convinced. Marcus, who had known me since childhood, grew increasingly vocal about his skepticism. "She's got you on a string, man," he said one night after Clara bailed on plans to join us for dinner. "Every time you try to pull her in, she pulls away. Doesn't that bother you?" I brushed him off, insisting that he didn't understand her, that Clara just needed time. But his words lingered, gnawing at me in the quiet moments when she wasn't around. Even so, the good times with Clara had a way of silencing all doubt. I remember one Saturday when she convinced me to skip my usual errands and drive out to the coast. It was a 2-hour trip, spontaneous and unplanned, but when we got there, she ran across the sand barefoot, her laughter carried on the wind, and I felt like I was witnessing pure freedom. She pulled me into the waves, soaking us both fully clothed, and though I grumbled at first, her joy was infectious. For a few hours I let go of every concern, every lingering suspicion, and just existed with her in that moment. I told myself then that if she could bring me this much happiness, maybe it was worth putting up with her walls. She had a way of making me believe she was vulnerable too. Late at night, when we lay tangled in blankets, she would tell me fragments of her past. A strained relationship with her father, a betrayal by someone she once loved. She never gave me the full picture, always cutting herself off before I could ask too many questions, but those fragments were enough to convince me she had been hurt, that her hesitations weren't about me but about wounds she hadn't healed. I told myself I could be the one to help her, to prove not everyone would abandon her. It fed into my instinct to fix things, to protect the people I cared about, even if it came at a cost to myself. What I didn't realize then was how carefully she controlled the narrative. She gave me just enough to make me feel important, to convince me I was part of her inner circle, while keeping the upper hand by withholding anything that might truly make her accountable. I was so caught up in the romance of it all that I didn't question why every story about her past cast her as the victim and someone else as the villain. I didn't see how she was laying the groundwork for what was to come, how those stories would eventually be used to justify the way she treated me. At that stage, I wasn't thinking about red flags. I was thinking about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, about how her hand fit perfectly in mine, about the laughter we shared when we danced clumsily in the kitchen to songs playing on the radio. I was caught in the glow of what I thought was love, blind to the fact that beneath her charm and spontaneity, Clara was setting rules I hadn't agreed to, rules I didn't even know existed. It was the beginning, yes, but it was also the foundation of something that would later become impossible to escape. Because while I thought I was building a relationship based on connection and trust, what I was really stepping into was a carefully constructed game, where the pieces only ever moved in her favor. And as much as I believed those early days were filled with love and promise, they were also filled with the subtle signs I chose not to see, signs that would only grow louder as time went on. For a stretch of time, things with Clara felt almost perfect, as though all the small cracks that had worried me before were patched over by the strength of our connection. It was the period I look back on now as the good times, the chapter where everything seemed possible, where hope outweighed doubt, and the bond between us felt undeniable. These were the days that made me believe in us, the days that convinced me she was worth every ounce of effort I poured into the relationship. Without these memories, I might have walked away much earlier, but because of them, I clung on long after I should have let go. Clara had a way of making ordinary moments feel extraordinary, and during those months, she leaned into that talent with abandon. She started showing up at my apartment more regularly, sometimes with bags of groceries, insisting that she wanted to cook dinner for me. The meals were never elaborate, simple pasta dishes, stir-fries that left the kitchen a mess, but they carried a sense of intimacy that I cherished. I'd sit at the counter watching her hum to herself as she chopped vegetables, her hair tied up messily, flour smudged on her cheek, and I would think to myself that this was what home was supposed to feel like. When we sat down to eat, she'd raise her glass to toast something silly, like to surviving Mondays, or to finding extra fries at the bottom of the bag, and I'd laugh because she managed to make even those small celebrations meaningful. Weekends were often the highlight of our time together. Clara thrived on spontaneity, and though it sometimes left me anxious, It also brought a kind of joy I hadn't experienced before. One Saturday morning, she woke me up at dawn, insisting we drive to the next town over just to try their famous pancakes. Another time, she dragged me to a flea market, where she convinced me to buy an old weathered guitar, even though I hadn't played in years. "You'll thank me," she said with a wink, and that night she begged me to strum a few chords while she twirled around the living room barefoot, laughing as though we were the only two people in the world. Those moments filled me with a warmth I didn't know I was missing. There were also quieter days, and those became just as precious. We'd curl up on the couch with a stack of old DVDs, watching movies neither of us had seen before, pausing to argue over plot twists or laugh at ridiculous lines. Clara had a habit of talking back to the characters on screen, as though they could hear her, and her commentary often made the movies twice as entertaining. Sometimes, after a long day at work, I'd come home to find her waiting for me with candles lit and music playing softly, determined to create an oasis where we could both forget the outside world. It was in those softer moments that I felt closest to her, when the chaos quieted and I could almost believe we were building something lasting. Even the people around me began to notice the shift. My mother, who had been cautious at first, admitted one evening after Sunday dinner that Clara had grown on her. "She brings out a different side of you," she said with a smile, though there was still a note of hesitation in her voice. Marcus remained skeptical, but even he had to admit that Clara had a charm that was difficult to resist. "She's got fire," he said after joining us for drinks one night. "I'll give her that. I just hope it doesn't burn you in the end." At the time, I laughed it off, too caught up in the glow of Clara's affection to take his warning seriously. During those good times, Clara seemed more open, more willing to let me in. She started sharing pieces of her past more freely, telling stories about her childhood, her dreams, even her fears. I clung to those late-night conversations, believing they were proof she was learning to trust me. One evening, lying together under the thin light of the street lamp filtering through my blinds, she confessed that she had always been afraid of being ordinary. "I can't just settle," she whispered, tracing circles on my chest. "I need to live big, even if it scares people." I kissed the top of her head and told her she didn't have to be anyone else to be special, that she already was. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that told me my words hadn't fully reached her. Still, I convinced myself that love was about patience, about standing by someone as they worked through their insecurities. The truth is, I was happy then, maybe even the happiest I'd been in years. Clara had become the center of my world, and I let her fill the spaces that had once felt lonely. My days revolved around when I'd see her next, and even though her unpredictability sometimes frustrated me, I told myself it was a small price to pay for the joy she brought into my life. I imagined a future with her, one with the rough edges smoothed out with time, where we built something solid together. The image was so vivid in my mind that it felt inevitable, as though it were only a matter of when, not if. Looking back now, I realize those good times were both real and an illusion. The laughter, the adventures, the tenderness, they happened, and they were genuine in their own way, but they were also part of the cycle, the highs that kept me invested even when the lows began to pull me under. Clara knew how to create moments that made me forget my doubts, that made me believe in her and in us, even when her actions didn't always align with her words. And I, blinded by hope and the need to believe in what we had, let those moments anchor me in a relationship that was already beginning to tilt toward something darker. It's strange, the way memory works. When I think back to that chapter of our story, I can still feel the warmth of her hand in mine, still hear her laughter echoing in my apartment, still see the light in her eyes when she spun barefoot across the floor. Those memories linger, stubborn and vivid, even as I know now that they were the bait that kept me trapped. They were the reason I ignored the first signs of trouble, the reason I stayed long after I should have walked away, because when the storm began to gather, I held on to the sunshine we once shared, convinced it would return if only I weathered the darkness long enough. At first, the changes were subtle, so quiet they almost slipped past me unnoticed, the kind of details you brush off because you don't want to make something out of nothing. Clara, who once filled my apartment with laughter and warmth, began to shift in ways I couldn't quite pin down. She still came around often, but the energy was different, almost brittle, as though she carried an invisible weight on her shoulders that she refused to set down. Conversations that had once flowed easily began to feel strained, interrupted by silences that grew too heavy. I told myself it was just stress, that everyone went through rough patches, And I leaned into patience because I wanted to believe our good times were still the truest version of us. But the signs were there, building quietly, daring me to pay attention. It started with her mood swings, sudden dips and turns that left me scrambling to keep up. One moment she'd be all fire and laughter, suggesting we drive out to the coast at midnight just to hear the waves crash, and the next she'd shut down completely, retreating into herself without explanation. I'd ask her what was wrong, and she'd brush me off with a flat "I'm fine," though her eyes told a different story. When I pressed, she grew defensive, snapping at me for prying, accusing me of not trusting her to handle her own feelings. I wanted to reassure her, to let her know I wasn't trying to control her, but she twisted my concern into interrogation, and I found myself apologizing for caring too much. Then there were the cancellations. Clara had always been spontaneous, but during the good times that spontaneity leaned toward surprise and delight. Now it began to manifest as unreliability. She'd make plans with me, dinners, weekend outings, small commitments, and then back out at the last minute, sometimes with a vague excuse about being tired, sometimes without offering any reason at all. One evening, after I had cooked us dinner and set the table, she texted me an hour after she was supposed to arrive. "Can't make it tonight. Sorry." No explanation, no call, just those few words. I sat there staring at the untouched plates, the food growing cold, wondering if I was asking too much just by expecting her to show up. What unsettled me more was how secretive she became. During our earlier months, she had been eager to share stories from her childhood, her dreams for the future, even her frustrations with work. But slowly she began to guard herself, closing doors I thought she had once opened. She started keeping her phone closer, angling it away when she typed out messages, brushing off questions about who she was talking to. If I asked, she would laugh in a way that wasn't really laughter at all, a sharp sound meant to disarm me, and say, "You don't have to know everything." I told myself not to be paranoid, that she deserved privacy, but the pit in my stomach told me something was shifting between us. It wasn't just me who noticed. Marcus, ever the skeptic, began to point out the changes too. "She's pulling back," he said one night as we nursed beers at the bar. "I don't think she's all in anymore." I bristled at his words, defensive, unwilling to let him plant doubt in my mind. "You don't know her like I do," I insisted. He shrugged, not pushing further, but the look in his eyes stayed with me. Even my mother, who had warmed to Clara during the good times, seemed to sense something off. After Clara skipped another family gathering she had promised to attend, my mother sighed and asked gently, "Is everything okay between you two?" I gave her the standard reassurance, but I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Despite all the warning signs, Clara still had ways of pulling me back in, of making me doubt my doubts. After a string of cancellations, she'd suddenly show up at my door with takeout, and that disarming smile, kissing me like I was the only person who mattered. When she laughed, when she curled up against me, when she whispered those soft words in the quiet of the night, I let myself believe everything was fine. Those flashes of intimacy were enough to convince me that the other moments, the silences, the cancellations, the secrecy, were just rough edges that would smooth out with time. I clung to those moments, like lifelines, convincing myself that love was about patience, about staying through the storms until the skies cleared again. But deep down, I knew the balance was shifting. I found myself second-guessing everything, weighing my words before speaking, careful not to say something that might trigger one of her sudden cold spells. I walked on eggshells without even realizing it, trying to keep the peace, trying to hold on to the version of Clara I had fallen for. I told myself this was just what relationships were, messy, imperfect, requiring compromise. But compromise began to feel like erasure, as though I was fading bit by bit to keep her from pulling away entirely. The nights were the hardest. Clara often stayed over less frequently, and when she did, she sometimes seemed distant even in bed, turning her back to me, staring at the ceiling long after I had fallen quiet. When I asked what she was thinking, she would shrug it off, claiming she was just tired. Once, in the dim light, I caught a flicker of something in her expression. Longing, maybe, or regret. And it chilled me in a way I couldn't explain. I wanted to ask, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid of confirming the thing I already suspected, that I was beginning to lose her. Looking back, I can see that the warning signs weren't small at all. They were glaring red flags waving in front of me, begging me to see them for what they were. But love makes you blind, or maybe it makes you hopeful to the point of delusion. I wanted so badly to believe in what Clara and I had built that I ignored the cracks spreading beneath the surface. I told myself this was just a phase, that if I held on long enough, we'd find our way back to the good times. What I didn't realize then was that those days were already gone, and no amount of patience or love could bring them back. The problems didn't just stay at the level of subtle silences and evasive excuses. They began to grow sharper, harder to deny, taking root in my daily life until I felt their weight pressing on me no matter what I did. Where once Clara's mood swings had been occasional storms, they became more frequent, unpredictable, like lightning striking out of nowhere. I never knew which version of her I would be dealing with when I saw her, the affectionate partner who drew me in with warmth, or the cold, defensive stranger who could cut me down with a single sentence. The shift was jarring, and I found myself on edge, my chest tightening every time her name flashed on my phone, unsure whether the message waiting for me would be an invitation or an accusation. The arguments became our new rhythm. They rarely started with anything monumental, but rather with the small, mundane details of everyday life. If I didn't answer her text within an hour, she accused me of ignoring her. If I made plans with Marcus or my sister without looping her in, she treated it like a betrayal. She would accuse me of not prioritizing her, of not putting her needs first, and no matter how much I tried to explain that I cared deeply, my words seemed to bounce off her, absorbed by some invisible wall she had erected. There was no winning, only enduring, because even when I gave in, even when I canceled my plans or dropped what I was doing to appease her, it never seemed to be enough. Her control extended in ways I hadn't expected. She began dictating how much time I should spend with others, insisting, that I was too available to people outside of our relationship. She framed it as concern, saying she just wanted me to have more focus, more ambition, but beneath that mask of care was an insistence that my world should orbit solely around her. At first, I tried to compromise, but as the weeks stretched on, I realized I was seeing less and less of the people who mattered to me. Marcus would call, and I'd hesitate before answering, knowing Clara might demand to know why I was talking to him so late. My mother asked when I would come by for Sunday dinner, and I found myself making excuses, ashamed that I was letting Clara's moods dictate my own availability. The isolation crept in like fog, and before I knew it, I was alone in ways I hadn't been before. Financial matters, too, became a battlefield. Clara had a way of talking about money that unsettled me. She'd make pointed comments about how much I earned compared to her, twisting it into a narrative where I owed her more dinners, more gifts, more gestures to prove my commitment. At first, I dismissed it as banter, but soon her words carried sharper edges. She would say things like, "If you really cared, you'd invest in us," or "Love without sacrifice is meaningless." Those statements left me uneasy, but I brushed them off because I didn't want to believe she meant them literally. Then came the requests, small at first, like covering her half of the rent 1 month when she claimed her paycheck was late, then larger, like asking me to pay for her new laptop because she said she needed it for work. Each time she framed it as temporary, as a sign of trust between us, and I convinced myself I was being supportive. But the resentment began to build quietly inside me, every dollar I handed over, adding weight to the invisible chain between us. It wasn't just what she took, but how she made me feel about it. Anytime I hesitated, she flipped the script, accusing me of being selfish, of not being invested in her dreams. "If you can't support me when I need it," she once snapped, "what does that say about you as a partner?" I remember standing there, stunned, wondering when helping became a requirement rather than a choice, when love became measured in money rather than care. But she was so good at twisting arguments, so skilled at making me second-guess myself, that I often caved, handing over what she asked just to end the tension. The worst part was the emotional whiplash. After an explosive argument where she accused me of not being enough, she'd often soften suddenly, breaking down into tears and apologizing. She'd bury her face in my chest, whispering that she didn't know why she acted that way, that she was just scared of losing me. Those moments of vulnerability disarmed me completely, making me believe that beneath all the chaos, she truly needed me. And so the cycle continued, A storm of accusations and demands, followed by tearful apologies and moments of tenderness that convinced me to stay. I became trapped in that cycle, clinging to the hope that the tenderness was the real her, and the rest was just pain she hadn't yet learned to control. But the toll was undeniable. I started waking up every morning with a knot in my stomach, bracing myself for what the day with Clara would bring. Work became harder to focus on because I was constantly distracted by her texts and calls, fearful of missing one and triggering another spiral. Sleep eluded me as my mind replayed our arguments, searching for the moment I could have handled things differently, convinced that if I just found the right words, the right actions, I could fix us. My body felt heavy, my spirit drained, yet I still told myself this was what commitment meant, that you didn't walk away when things got hard. The people around me noticed. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated with me, telling me I was losing myself, that I was bending too far just to keep Clara satisfied. My sister voiced concern, saying I looked tired, that my smile didn't reach my eyes anymore. I dismissed them both, too proud to admit how much I was struggling, too afraid to face the possibility that they were right. But deep down, I knew something was broken. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this, like a constant battle where you lose a little more of yourself every day. What made it worse was Clara's ability to make me question my own perception of reality. She would deny things she had clearly said, insisting I was remembering wrong, or she'd twist events to make it seem like I was the one at fault. More than once, I found myself apologizing for things I hadn't even done, just to restore some semblance of peace. It was as if she held a mirror up to me, reflecting a distorted version of myself that I barely recognized, and over time, I began to wonder if maybe she was right, if maybe I really was the problem. By then, the problems were no longer creeping. They were crashing down around me. The Clara I had once adored felt like a stranger who had replaced the woman I thought I knew. I was living in a state of constant tension, waiting for the next argument, the next demand, the next manipulation. And yet, even as the walls closed in, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Because for every night I lay awake questioning everything, there was still that lingering memory of her laughter, of the good times that seemed so close yet impossibly far. I didn't want to admit it, but I was already caught in a trap, and each day it grew harder to imagine how I would ever escape. It's strange how sometimes you need someone else to tell you what you already know in your gut before you can finally admit it to yourself. By this point, Clara's behavior had become such a constant in my life that I almost normalized it, telling myself it was just a phase, just stress, just something we'd work through with enough patience. But people around me weren't so easily convinced. They could see the wear on my face, the fatigue in my eyes, the way my voice sounded different when I spoke about her. It started with small questions, then shifted into pointed concerns, until the truth I had been dodging was echoed back to me in ways I could no longer ignore. Marcus was the first, and the loudest. One evening we were sitting on the back porch of his apartment, a couple of beers between us, the city lights flickering in the distance. He didn't dance around the subject like he had before. "Man, you've changed," he said, his tone carrying more gravity than usual. "And not in a good way. Every time I see you, you're more drained, more beaten down. And it's because of her." I tried to argue, to tell him that relationships were hard work, that I was just trying to be supportive. But he cut me off. "There's supportive, and then there's losing yourself. She's pulling you apart, piece by piece. You don't laugh like you used to. You don't hang out anymore. You're constantly anxious. That's not love, man. That's control." His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. My sister, Danielle, added her voice not long after. She invited me to dinner one Sunday, and I almost didn't go because I knew Clara would question why I was spending time away from her. But something inside me pushed me to show up, maybe because I craved the familiarity of family. Danielle didn't wait long before speaking her mind. "You're not yourself," she said bluntly, eyes searching mine across the table. "You look like someone who's constantly apologizing for things he hasn't done. I can see it in the way you hunch your shoulders, the way you second-guess every word before it leaves your mouth. That's not the brother I know." I tried to shrug it off, but she pressed further. I don't know what Clara is doing, but it's not love if you're miserable. It's not love if you're scared to breathe wrong around her. Hearing those words from her, someone who had known me since childhood, was like having a mirror held up to my soul. Even my mother, who had always been careful not to overstep when it came to my relationships, couldn't keep quiet. She invited me over for lunch one afternoon, and after we ate, she lingered at the table with her tea. "I don't want to interfere," she began cautiously, "but I need to say this. You don't seem happy. In fact, I think I've seen you more worried in the past few months than I have in years. I know you love her, but sometimes love isn't enough, especially when it's draining the life out of you." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "You deserve someone who brings out the best in you, not someone who makes you doubt your worth." I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, the lump in my throat too heavy to swallow. It wasn't just the people closest to me who noticed. Even acquaintances began to make passing comments. A coworker pulled me aside one day after a meeting and asked if I was okay, noting how distracted I seemed. An old friend I hadn't seen in months remarked on how tired I looked when we bumped into each other at the grocery store. Each observation chipped away at the denial I had so carefully built, each one confirming that what I was experiencing wasn't invisible. It was written all over me, plain enough for anyone to see. What really drove it home, though, was a conversation with Marcus after yet another blow-up with Clara. She had accused me of not loving her enough because I didn't immediately agree to cover another one of her expenses. She stormed out of my apartment, leaving me in pieces, and I called Marcus just to vent. I recounted the argument, every twist and turn of her words, and when I was finished, there was silence on his end. Finally, he said, "Do you hear yourself? She's manipulating you, man. Every single time. She demands, you resist, she blows up, and then you give in. It's a cycle, and it's only getting worse." He sighed, frustration thick in his voice. "You deserve better than this constant punishment. She's not building you up, she's tearing you down." For once, I didn't argue back. I just sat there, staring at the wall, realizing he was right. That night, I lay awake, replaying not just Marcus's words, but everyone else's too. I thought about Danielle's piercing observation, my mother's gentle concern, the countless little comments from friends and acquaintances. It was like a chorus of voices all saying the same thing. This isn't love, this isn't healthy, you're losing yourself. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the hope that Clara and I could find our way back to what we once had, I couldn't shake the truth anymore. I was clinging to a version of her that no longer existed, if it had ever existed at all. The hardest part was admitting to myself that they weren't exaggerating. I could see it too, the way my shoulders slumped, the way my eyes looked hollow in the mirror, the way I hesitated before speaking as if every word might be wrong. I had become a shadow of the person I used to be, and all the love in the world couldn't justify that kind of erosion. Clara might have been the spark that lit up my life once, but now she was the fire consuming me, leaving only ash in her wake. As I lay there in the dark, I realized the validation from others wasn't just about confirming my pain. It was about giving me permission to acknowledge it, to stop excusing it, to start believing that maybe I wasn't crazy, maybe I wasn't weak, maybe I wasn't the problem. It was the beginning of a shift, a crack in the foundation of denial that had kept me tethered to something toxic. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper the truth in the silence of my own mind. Maybe I needed to let her go. It all came to a head one rainy Thursday night. The kind of night where the storm outside feels like a reflection of the chaos brewing within. Clara had shown up at my apartment unannounced, her eyes sharp, her tone clipped from the moment she crossed the threshold. I could tell something was brewing before she even spoke. The way she tossed her bag on the floor, the way she looked at me as if I were already guilty of some unspoken crime. When she finally let it out, it wasn't about a missed text or a canceled dinner. This time, it was money again. She wanted me to cover the down payment on a car she had her eye on, something sleek and new. Something I knew I couldn't afford without draining savings I had worked years to build. When I hesitated, when I told her honestly that I couldn't do it, her face hardened into something I barely recognized. "You always say you love me, but when it comes time to prove it, you fail," she spat, her words like knives. "What's the point of being with someone who won't invest in me, who won't support me? Do you even care about my future?" I tried to reason with her, to explain that love wasn't about financial transactions, that I had been supportive in countless ways. I reminded her of the bills I had covered, the laptop I had bought, the countless small expenses I had taken on without complaint. But she dismissed them all with a wave of her hand, as if none of it mattered. "That was nothing compared to this," she snapped. "If you can't step up now, then maybe you never will." The argument spiraled, growing louder and harsher until it felt like the walls were shaking with the force of it. For every calm explanation I tried to give, she met me with scorn and accusations. She called me selfish, unambitious, weak. She told me I was wasting her time, that she could find someone better, someone willing to give her what she deserved. And, for the first time, instead of shrinking under her words, I felt something inside me crack. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was fury, a raw and unfiltered recognition that I was being used, manipulated, reduced to a wallet and a punching bag. When she stormed out that night, slamming the door behind her, I sat in the silence that followed and realized I was shaking. My hands trembled, my chest heaved, and I felt the weight of months of suppression pressing down on me, all at once. I thought about Marcus's words, Danielle's concern, my mother's gentle warning. I thought about all the nights I had lost sleep, all the times I had walked on eggshells, all the moments I had doubted myself, because Clara had twisted reality to suit her needs. And I realized, with an almost terrifying clarity, that this wasn't just unhealthy, it was destroying me. The next day, she texted me as if nothing had happened. "Hey, are you going to think about the car? We can go see it this weekend." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the storm from the night before. Just another demand, another expectation that I would bend to her will. That was the moment I knew. Something in me finally snapped, not in anger, but in resolution. This wasn't love, not anymore, and maybe it never truly had been. It was control, manipulation, and a steady erosion of who I was. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, looking at my own reflection, really seeing myself for the first time in months. The dark circles under my eyes, the tension etched into my face, the slump in my posture. It was like staring at a stranger. "This isn't me," I whispered to myself. And in that moment, I felt a strange kind of relief wash over me. The denial was gone. The excuses were gone. All that was left was the truth. If I didn't leave now, I might never get myself back. That weekend, Clara showed up again, expecting business as usual, expecting me to cave like I always did. Instead, I told her plainly, "I can't do this anymore." The words felt foreign on my tongue, shaky at first, but they gained strength as I repeated them. She laughed at first, as if I were joking. But when she saw the steadiness in my eyes, her laughter curdled into rage. "You're pathetic," she sneered. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've put into this?" Her words should have cut me, but instead they fell flat, powerless against the clarity I now carried. I told her she had to go, that this was the end, and for once I didn't flinch when she shouted, when she threatened, when she hurled every insult she could muster. I stood my ground, heart pounding but unshaken, because I knew this was the moment everything changed. After she left, truly left, the silence in my apartment was deafening, but it was also liberating. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the weight of her presence pressing down on me. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. The chains had been broken, and though I didn't yet know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. That night, as the storm outside finally cleared, I sat by the window and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was enough to remind me that I was still here, still capable of reclaiming myself. And in that quiet, I understood that hitting rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the beginning of my climb back up. The days after Clara's departure were strangely disorienting, like walking through a house that was suddenly too quiet after years of constant noise. At first, I found myself reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting another barrage of messages, another demand, another carefully worded guilt trip. But the silence stretched on, unfamiliar and oddly unnerving. It was as though my body hadn't yet caught up to the reality that she was gone, that I had actually done it. I had ended the cycle that had been draining me for so long. The emptiness was both terrifying and comforting, a duality I wrestled with each morning when I woke up alone. I wasn't free of the shadows she left behind. Her voice still echoed in my head, whispering doubts and accusations. But slowly, a different voice began to emerge. My own. In those first weeks, I forced myself into routines that grounded me. I started running again, something I had abandoned months earlier when Clara scoffed at how much time it took away from her. Each step on the pavement became a small rebellion, a reminder that I still had control over my own choices. I reconnected with Marcus, who didn't say, "I told you so," but instead invited me out for coffee, where he listened without judgment as I poured out the story in jagged fragments. He reminded me that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it without letting it consume you. Danielle checked in often too, sometimes just sending a silly meme or a short text that said, "Thinking of you." Those small gestures were lifelines, anchors that tethered me back to a sense of community I had neglected while drowning in Clara's world. I began to notice changes in myself, subtle at first but undeniable. I no longer hesitated before speaking, bracing for criticism that wouldn't come. I laughed more easily, unguarded and genuine, not the careful performance I had perfected in her presence. I started cooking again, experimenting in the kitchen without fear of being ridiculed for wasting time. My apartment, once filled with the tension of her presence, began to feel like mine again. I redecorated small corners, moved furniture, lit candles in the evening, creating spaces that reflected who I was rather than who I had tried to be for her. Each act, no matter how small, felt like a reclamation. But healing wasn't a straight line. There were nights when loneliness gnawed at me, when I missed the illusion of companionship more than I missed Clara herself. I would catch myself scrolling through old photos, remembering fleeting moments when things seemed good, and wonder if I had been too harsh, too quick to walk away. Those were the hardest nights, the ones where doubt tried to creep back in and rewrite the truth. Yet every time, I reminded myself of that stormy Thursday, of the way she had demanded more than I could give, of the way she had made me feel small, broken, and inadequate. Love should never feel like losing yourself, I repeated like a mantra, and gradually the memories lost their sting. One morning, as I sat in a cafe watching the rain streak down the windows, I overheard a couple at the next table laughing, their hands brushing together naturally, without calculation. Something in me shifted then, not envy but clarity. I realized that real love wasn't supposed to be a performance or a battlefield. It was supposed to feel safe, effortless in its honesty. And I promised myself that if I ever opened my heart again, it would be to someone who saw me, not the version they could shape or exploit, but the messy, imperfect, authentic me. Months passed, and the grip of the past loosened. Clara tried to reach out once, a short message late at night that read, "Miss you." For a fleeting second, the old reflex tugged at me, the instinct to respond, to fold myself back into her orbit. But then I remembered the price I had paid, the toll it had taken on my mind, my friendships, my very sense of self. I deleted the message without replying. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally broken free, not just physically, but emotionally. Looking back now, I can see how insidiously it all began, how easy it was to mistake control for care, possession for passion. I don't hate her. Hatred would still give her power. Instead, I see her as a lesson, a mirror reflecting the boundaries I failed to hold and the strength I eventually found. I don't regret the time I spent with her, because without it I might never have learned the most important truth. Love should never cost you your freedom, your dignity, or your sense of worth. As I write this, the sun is setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The air feels different now, lighter, as though the world itself is conspiring to remind me that endings are not just closures, they are beginnings. I don't know what comes next, but I know I am stepping into it whole, carrying forward not the weight of her words but the quiet certainty of my own. And that is enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.